the last couple of months in Rise of Kingdoms, we've seen a very large amount of legendary commanders coming through the game. We've seen there are going to be 2 new archers, we've had the 2 new infantry, we had the 2 new cavalry, and now we've also been shown the Ragnar Prime, this whole entire new super interesting legendary commander. And there has been a little bit of a trend in the Rise of Kingdoms commander meta, moving towards a bit of a different future for commanders. So today, I'll be discussing this trend, what the future for Rise of Kingdoms commanders looks like, and if it's a good or bad future, and how you should prepare. So if you're interested in the future of legendary commanders in Rise of Kingdoms, and what it means for you, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now, as I did for my Archer video when I discussed the way that archers will be changing in the future, I want to do the same thing here by starting off with how are commanders released currently, or how were they released before we see all of these new changes. And the first thing we should note about how commanders were released before is they often followed what I would call a very structural and pretty much set formula. They had skill damage, they had stats, and then they had more stats. That's pretty much all they did, or more damage. And every single commander back to like the start of time was the same, maybe besides like Tomyris, because she had a really unique debuff. Other than that, pretty much most of the commanders were the same. Even Tomyris with her debuff got taken on by Chandragupta, and then also by the infantry commander Sargon. So every single commander followed some trend of a commander that came before them. That was pretty much a guarantee. Most commanders either had a single target or an AoE active skill, or they had an active skill where they dealt damage over time. And the only form of damage factor was at the time really normal damage, which you could see through Attila, or through actual direct damage, which was pretty much every single other commander. So most commanders pretty much held that ability, and then the only other real different stuff was you had the ability to heal and the ability to shield on a couple of commanders. But for the majority, most commanders were very, very similar. You can compare, let's just say, random infantry commanders. We can just say Harold here. Harold is dealing skill damage on the first skill, and he's got stats on the second skill. And if we go to, let's say, Scipio, skill damage on the first skill, stats on the second skill. Third skill, Scipio's got stats. Fourth skill, Scipio's got stats. And it's really, really cut and dry. Most commanders would have some setup that is similar to this, and it pretty much means you can almost predict what commanders might be releasing, or really what they could be doing for the meta, because if they release a commander that has certain skills with certain stats, you pretty much know what they're going to do. You pretty much know if they're going to be good or bad. So that was really the current trend at the time. And also, one other thing we should note, the release cycle was Cav, Infantry, Archers, and then it was leadership or engineering, and that is also being changed up a little bit, and again, I will discuss that very soon. So just to re-clarify, the current meta or the previous meta for commander releases, or at least what we saw, was commanders that dealt skill damage, they had stats throughout their kit, and usually those stats allowed them to deal more damage. They either had some form of a debuff, or they were just dealing extra stats, so they made it more tanky or gave them a slightly better trade. That is what we used to see, and that is the current trend that people are still thinking about. However, we have noticed a bit of a shift towards a new trend, and I've seen it a lot over the course of really infantry, I would say around last year, but really for the whole entire game, we've started to see this trend throughout this year. There is a lot of what I want to say new mechanics coming to the game. We've seen smite damage for infantry. We've now seen the, let's say, mighty healing damage for archers and the true damage and that whole entire really, really interesting commander kit. And then infantry also have Ragnar Prime, who's got a whole new form of debuffing where he siphons stats off his opponent. So whenever Ragnar Prime is putting a march speed debuff on his opponent, it actually makes him faster, which is something we've never seen before. And then even for cavalry, they receive something a little bit new through Belisarius with an instant debuff that deals more when you're surrounding, and also the way that he's giving rage requirement increases, which again we have never seen, and it almost acts like a silence that archers can't counter. So there's all of these really new mechanics that have been added to the game, and it kind of does tell you that there is a bit of a new trend going on. Lilith seems to be moving away from just stats, more stats, stronger stats, better commander, into more unique commanders with something that are a little bit different to their predecessors. So Belisarius Prime is not similar to Nevsky, but Hao Bing, if you really think about it, is similar to Nevsky. Single target stats, 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 stats. Nevsky, when you look at him, single target stats, 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 stats. Pretty much identical commanders, just different stats and different types of damage factor. That is the only thing. But when you look at Belisarius Prime, it's night and day. He's got nothing besides maybe the single target. His stats are, of course, still similar, but the fact that he's got the rage requirement increase is really, really different. And the fact that he's got that really interesting debuff on his expertise skill where it requires you to surround targets. Of course, Nevsky does that, but this is surrounding targets up to 5 troops and it's instant. We don't normally see that. And not to mention, it's a never-ending debuff. This is something we haven't really seen before. Of course, infantry, I don't even need to go too in depth with them. We've seen smite damage, that's all you need to say. It's completely different to skill damage. And also, like I said, Ragnar Prime, he's a completely different commander to anything we've ever seen with the way that he's doing debuffs. Usually debuffs would either give you stats, usually a commander could give themselves stats through a buff, or they could take away or reduce an opponent's stats. That is all that debuffs could really do. But now you're able to, with Ragnar Prime, siphon stats off your opponents and make your own march stronger, which means if you hit a march and you give him, let's say, a 30% health siphon, which obviously isn't in the game yet, but it is possible now, you could see a commander that's giving themselves a 30% health buff and also giving your opponents a 30% health debuff, which, as you can imagine, is much stronger than Scipio Africanus' active skill. So that is a very unique thing we've seen with infantry, and archers have probably seen the most drastic shift since we've seen Shajar and the Garrison Archer Commander. They both use Mighty Healing and True Damage as a form of damage factor and also their own support, and it is completely different to anything we've ever seen. The fact they're dealing damage off healing just makes, well, no, it doesn't make no sense. It is just completely different to anything in the game. There's literally to that nothing close. You could argue there's something similar to smite damage, it's just a form of damage factor. You could argue that there's something similar to, let's say, maybe even the siphoning stats, because you're able to, let's say, debuff your opponents with Hermann Prime, but also increase your skill damage. It kind of works like a siphon through the poison there, or any skill damage increase on your opponents is kind of a siphon. You can even say that the ability on Belisarius Prime is similar to Nevsky, and the fact that his active skill is dealing that increased rage requirement is pretty much just giving your opponents a rage reduction. But at the end of the day, there's nothing even close to Mighty Healing and also True Damage. Another thing I'll also like to look at is range commanders, which are literally just completely different commanders. There's nothing in the game even close to this, because, I mean, they are literally made to deal a unique form of damage. It's called range damage. They have ranged smite damage. They've got ranged AoE, which is a new thing. And they've got, well, they're bringing back some old things such as the disarm effect. So there is definitely, again, another shift towards these newer commanders, which are doing something a little bit different. Another trend that we have seen over the last year, at least this year especially, is commanders haven't seemed to be as meta breaking. I mean, William Wallace, good example. He's a strong commander, sure, but he's not really meta dominant. If you have William Wallace, you're going to trade better than if you don't. But if it's not like Liu Che, if you don't have him in your meta pool, you're going to get screwed. He's just an amazing commander, and he's one of the best in the game, if not the best in the game. Belisarius Prime, another example. He's good, sure, but he's not absolutely game-breaking. He can work with your marches. He'll make your meta pool stronger. But if you still ran a William, I mean, you'd be fine, and it wouldn't even be too insane. So again, he's strong, he's definitely an upgrade, but he's not ridiculously meta-breaking. And I think that's definitely going to be another thing that we see over the coming years, is maybe a few less absolute meta-dominant commanders, because I know a lot of people were very upset, or at least I personally was as well, but I know I've seen a lot of comments on my videos of people saying, it's kind of dumb how you max a commander, and then a couple of months later, that commander is pretty much useless, or not a couple months, let's say a year or two, they're useless or they're much weaker, and people obviously didn't like that. But it seems like there's a bit of a shift now towards commanders which do something new and unique that allow you to counter certain types of commanders, but they aren't literally fully meta breaking. You don't 100% need them, and you can certainly manage with your current meta pool. Of course, power creep is still going to exist. We will see stronger commanders, I don't doubt it, but I think that it's going to at least either take a new approach in making newer unique commanders, or it's going to take an approach where it's not as drastic and you can slowly upgrade your meta pool, allowing people to have a bit more freedom and a bit more ability to choose commanders which you normally wouldn't choose, since you would have to only invest in the meta. So a lot of people might choose to get William Wallace, even though he's not absolutely insane, because he is something a little bit different. He's a single target smite commander, he's got stuff like normal damage reductions, and the way that he's giving your other troops shielding effects. So all of this stuff is obviously interesting, the way he's dispelling slows. These things have existed before, he's not the best example, but that being said, you can certainly pick up a William nowadays, and it wouldn't be too bad, because I reckon the next couple of commanders won't be ridiculously meta breaking either. Not to say they'll be bad, but they might not be as meta breaking if Lilith sticks to their current trend. And the last real different trend that we have been seeing is the fact that there's going to be a third infantry commander in 1 year. That is something we've never ever seen before. The fact that it's been announced at least in one cycle is something pretty much unprecedented. Of course, again, he probably won't be absolutely meta breaking. We don't know his stats or anything yet, but this is just again something we've never ever seen. It could be an anniversary commander, that's my guess, but there is also word floating around that he could be an exhibition commander, where you can go and get him in the expedition shop instead of Ethelflaed, and that is also certainly possible. If that's the case, I would say it's kind of at least more warranted, it makes more sense. Or if he's a civilization commander, which I doubt, I mean, he's a legendary, so it wouldn't make sense to make him a civilization commander, but something inside the expedition shop, certainly possible, and that means this commander might make a little bit more sense. It might not be a wheel commander or an MGE commander, but again, it does just kind of show we're seeing a few more commanders than normal. Also, the fact that we've got engineering now and leadership also releasing. You get 2 engineering, you get 1 leadership currently in each cycle. That's what we've been seeing. So there is again a bit of a trend of there being more commanders, but they're not as meta breaking. I haven't seen, let's say, Lapu. Lapu, for example, being an absolute meta breaker. He's pretty much a useless commander. I don't even think he's on my tier list because I keep forgetting about him. So there is definitely a trend of seeing more commanders in Rise of Kingdoms who don't seem to be as meta dominant, at least during this year. So now here is where I'm going to get a little bit more opinionated, and I'm going to answer a question of, is this new meta good or bad for commanders? The fact that we're seeing more commanders, but they're more unique, is this a good or a bad thing? And I think as always with everything, there needs to be a bit of a balance. If we just constantly see ridiculously new mechanics that are just game breaking, or just not even game breaking, but just completely different, that's obviously going to be bad for the game, because not everyone's going to be able to access all these new mechanics, especially if we see a new mechanic for every single troop type, maybe every 2 or so commander release cycles. It just would not be feasible, and it would also kind of lead to a meta, again, where you would have to focus more in on one troop type than you would on another, at least a lot more, because all these troop types will be getting new mechanics and a bunch of new stuff that we've never ever seen, and you won't really know what it's going to do. Another thing that could be bad is if this meta becomes really unpredictable to the point where all the commanders are either really weird and you don't know if they're going to be meta in the future, or it's at a point where it's really hard to tell what these commanders are actually doing for the meta because they're just so different, where they're kind of in their own world just doing a random thing, if that kind of makes sense. So if we see commanders in a situation where they're just super different and that's all we're getting, it might not be the best thing for Rise of Kingdoms, at least in terms of commander release cycles. But that being said, if we continue with a trend similar to what's happening to infantry, where smite damage was a new mechanic, it's been instituted for quite a while, and it's been pretty decent, and it's probably going to stick around for another 2-3 years if I had to guess, that is definitely a good meta. We're seeing something new, something a little bit refreshing on the game, something a little bit different from just normal skill damage, and it's also helped bring the troop into a little bit of a more meta spotlight. Again, it also does help counter cavalry, who were ridiculously strong up until recently because they were just so meta dominant. So things like that, where you create these new types of abilities or these new powers to destroy a certain troop type that is much too strong, or to help a troop type that is much too weak, is, in my opinion, good for the game's health. And if it's constantly, or at least similar in each commander release, so for example, the next infantry release, as long as it's smite damage and not something new, I would say that is a win for the game. Of course, Ragnar, I'm pretty sure he is smite. I haven't read through all of his skills fully, I only know a couple of them, but I'm pretty sure he's a smite commander. So the fact that infantry seem to have that new consistent meta of being smite commanders is a good thing for the game, and I think that giving him that will allow you to institute the rock, paper, scissors, where infantry beat cavalry a little bit more. Same thing can be said with archers. If mighty healing becomes the new thing for archers and we see a lot more mighty healing and true damage, that I can say is healthy for the game meta, and it would not be bad at all. It would just slowly phase out these older skill damage commanders. Now, I don't know if it really makes sense to make mighty heal a permanent thing because, well, the archer set has a 3% skill damage bonus in it that you won't be able to benefit from if you use true damage, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But if they slowly do phase it out, I don't see that being a very large problem as well. But again, if they make really sporadic changes where you can't really adapt to the meta, that's not going to be good. You're going to have to get new formations. You're going to have to switch up your formation. So for example, my wedge formation, I have to switch to arch formation for my new marchers when I get Shajar, because she's completely different. Or if I really want to get really good, I'll use the circle formation so I can deal more damage through the healing, because more healing equals more damage with her. So definitely, it's a very weird meta to adapt to, and if it's constantly like that, where you constantly have to adapt to a different commander meta, it will not be a good thing. So unless we get some consistency again, where you get certain commander releases, which you pretty much can guarantee will do certain things, like infantry smite, archers deal mighty heal and true damage, and then calves do damage factor, that is a good cycle to be in, and you can again make a rock, paper, scissors effect, where let's say smite damage can counter normal skill damage, and then you've got true damage can counter smite damage and also mighty healing, and then damage factor can counter mighty healing commanders, so that calves can be archers, archers can be infantry, and infantry can be cavalry. So in that situation, that would be a good thing. But if we do see a lot of sporadic, really ridiculous commander changes where they just are super, super different every single time, that might be bad for the game's health. The final thing I will discuss is how should you prepare for this new kind of meta. And I think the best thing to do with always is just kind of save your gold heads, especially now. Be a little bit more conservative. If you're working or thinking of working on a slightly older commander, maybe skip them. I would say that anyone that hasn't been released within like the last year, with an exception of Zulang or Liu Che, I probably would not touch them. So Nevsky, I know that's crazy to say, I just wouldn't pick him up nowadays. We don't know if the Cavs might get something ridiculously powerful in the upcoming Cavs, because their release cycle should be really, really soon. So Nevsky, I'd be skipping. I'd even be skipping Joan. I wouldn't really be building a Cav March now. They're very, very much due for a new commander, and I think they're due for something a little bit more meta because they are so far behind the meta. Infantry, I wouldn't be picking up Scipio nowadays. I definitely wouldn't be picking up Guan nowadays, or any commanders besides Smite commanders, until we see if there are more skill damage commanders in the future. So for infantry, if you're going to pick something up, Liu Che is a good option. Put him with whatever you have currently, maybe Alex, maybe you do have William, put them together. That's a fine march. I wouldn't say that's at risk of falling out the meta. And for archers, sure as hell, don't pick anything up now until we see what the new mighty healing and true damage commanders do. So that's my real recommendation right now. Try and ignore some of these older commanders who, while they are still good right now, may not have as much future potential. If we see a lot of new mechanics, they either counter them or they get a whole new mechanic in their troop type, which might make them weaker or at least weaken the older commanders. So if Cavs get some type of new damage, Nevsky may lose a lot of value, which of course means if you invest in him, you might get a little bit screwed over. So if you already have Nevsky maybe at like 5.551 and you're considering expertising him, just stop there. I reckon it's worth getting slightly worse trades for now, so you can save up gold heads and expertise either the next Cavs or whatever the new meta thing is that will come out in the future. So new mechanics, definitely something to keep an eye out for, especially for Cavs since they haven't seen anything ridiculously new. But overall, I wouldn't be investing in any commanders which are really over a year old, again, with the exception of maybe Zulang, because he is an AoE machine, and that is kind of an exemption to the rule. But things like Boudica Prime, Henry, YSG, definitely I wouldn't be picking up. Nebu, Shivani Pal, I'm kind of on the fence about. Maybe I wouldn't pick him up, but that's kind of up to you. Herman Prime, he's probably safe. But a lot of those older archer commanders I'd definitely be skipping as well, because it just makes sense to prepare for a possible new meta once Shajar does release. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, I just want to ask you guys for a very small favor, and that is consider joining my Discord. My Discord server is a really good place to ask me or other members of the channel for help with your account. Maybe you're considering investing in a commander, maybe you want to know what equipment you should build, whatever it is, my Discord is going to be a very good place. You can send images, you can DM me, you can put them in certain chats and get responses. It's a really, really good place to join. The link to join my Discord will be in the pinned comment and also in the description. And if you don't like it, you're always extremely free to leave. So please do consider joining the Discord. It's a fun place. I love having you guys there. And the link, pinned comment, and description. Now, as I say, I thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.